And as you haven't already noticed, we have an addition to our platform rotation, and that is Lori Durgan, Reverend Lori Durgan, who is associate minister of this church. She's been here longer than anyone in this room practically, and she started back in the 1980s with Richard Barnes as Sunday school, and then I hired her as the administrative director, and then she became the associate minister, and she's adding so much to our services, and I just think that it's important for us to acknowledge you. Thank you. There's an intention in your heart, and it got you here. And it may have been a very primitive intention once upon a time. Perhaps you were like my teacher, Jane Hart, my meditation teacher. She's going to be here in 3 weeks speaking the Sunday after Easter on moving into Christ consciousness. But her move into Christ consciousness started with a very primitive understanding and desire. And yet that desire started the ball rolling. She was 4 or 5 years old, and she was sitting next to her grandma. And her grandma was married to a very dour and difficult fundamentalist minister who wouldn't allow little Janie to dance, because we all know where people who dance end up. And she didn't have a great warm feeling for her grandpa, but her grandma was a beautiful soul who was faith-filled, had a beautiful heart, and she would play the piano and sing old hymns. And one of them that she would sing along with little Janie at the age of 4 or 5 was "In the Garden." You remember "In the Garden"? And when the lyrics came, "And he walks with me and he talks with me," little Janie turned to her grandma and she said, "Grandma, God's going to talk to me." And she meant it. And her grandma said, "Oh, that's so sweet. Yes, dear." Only Janie didn't stop saying it. And as she got older, she said it to her parents. And finally, she reached an age where her parents, this was in the 1940s, said to her, "Janie, you don't, God's not going to talk to you. I'm sorry. That happened in the Bible and that happened to other people. But you're going to grow up and be a housewife and take care of a husband and some children. And that's what you can expect. So let go of this God talking to you business." And she said, "No, I know God's going to talk to me." And she finally learned to keep her mouth shut, but she didn't keep her heart shut. She opened her heart and continued to desire this. And she knew somewhere within herself that God would talk to her. And yet, when it finally happened, two things. First, the God that talked to her wasn't the God that she had in mind when she was 4 or 5 years old. God was so much more. It wasn't just a primitive little girl's understanding, although that was sweet, of what God was. It was something greater than that. She had to grow into the person who could receive the truth of her prayer, even though she didn't know what the truth was. And the second thing was, how God talked to her was also a little bit different than what she had in mind. She she certainly has had many mystical experiences, but she found that God talked to her in an infinite number of ways, and sometimes not literally, sometimes in ways that were entirely spiritual and could not be articulated in words. But God did talk to her. Now, where in your life, if you had a desire in your heart that you wanted to set forth, an intention that you truly, well, every prayer is cutting a pattern in space and time, is inserting a cause in space and time. You're inserting with your prayer something that then moves forth, but it changes in its form as you change, and it grows you. It grows you. But it grows you through a process that we're going to be celebrating next week. And next week is what? It's Palm Sunday, the beginning of Holy Week. And Palm Sunday is the first of 3 steps of the Holy Week experience, which I'm giving you a little peek behind the curtain. We're going to talk about it first today, and then I think it'll help us to set a strong intention next week. Palm Sunday represents the setting of an intention. It's the first of the 3-step process, the 3 steps being, what do you want, what's in the way, and what are you going to do about it? What do you want? Is Palm Sunday. It's the inserting of a cause. Jesus came into Jerusalem. It was the great hosannas. It was the speaking of the word. It was the moving forth with a desire in the heart. Then came Good Friday, which was the what's in the way, which is everything that is unlike it comes up. I bet you that many of the people who were there on Palm Sunday were also there on Good Friday saying the opposite. It's everything unlike your intention needs to be released. There must be a release of every limiting circumstance. Otherwise, we'd already be there, right? We would already have the answer to our prayer. And then finally, on Easter is the fulfillment, which is not an end result. Easter was not a finished, it wasn't a finished product. It was the beginning of a process that continues to unfold in infinite ways. And your answered prayer is truly a fulfillment. So when Jane Hart, the little Janie, was setting forth her intention, yes, that was her Palm Sunday, but then she had all the opposition, all the people who said that she couldn't hear the voice of God, that this God that they believed in was so primitive that that God really couldn't inspire her. And yet she had the fulfillment of the Easter where it's constantly unfolding as she continues to grow, and it's an unfoldment in her heart and soul. Now, this morning we're talking about the experience of the children of Israel. We're talking about the experience of Moses leading them to the promised land. That follows these three steps as well. What do you want? That desire was the desire of Moses in a very primitive understanding. Now you know the famous story of Moses being adopted by the royal family, and then he saw somebody beating a member of what was truly his tribe, the Hebrews, which he didn't even know at the time, and he killed that person. So that's a very primitive desire, primitively expressed, but the desire was for freedom. There was a seed of something good in the middle of that desire. And so many of our desires look kind of wonky at first, but if you look at the middle of them, look back in your life, something that maybe you imperfectly express, but there's something there. And then, of course, everything unlike it came forth. He received his marching orders. He heard the voice in the burning bush saying, I am that I am. I am actively being. I'm the verb to be. God as activity, as being. And I'm telling you to take these people who are your people to the promised land. And his first reaction was what? I'm not worthy. I'm not good enough. And doesn't that happen in us? I can't do this. I mean, I'm not articulate enough. And then he was given his brother Aaron to be a spokesman. And every one of these considerations came up in his face, such as 10 plagues had to come up because the Pharaoh wouldn't allow his people to go. And then after the Pharaoh did let the people go, he sent the armies after them, and they had the parting of the Red Sea and all the rest of that to show this power. And then the people of Israel, when they heard what the scouts were saying, that there were giants in the promised land and they couldn't go there and they might as well just turn around and go home, because they believed that instead of the two scouts who said, no, we can do this thing. They listened to their fears rather than their faith, the voice of limitation rather than the voice of possibility. Moses said to him, you're going to be wandering around for 40 years until you can grow into the people who can receive this answer. And where in your life have you had to grow into the person who could receive the answer, the desire of your heart? Where you may have thought that you were ready, but you weren't quite ready. You had to go through what we might be likened to the wandering in the wilderness. You had to, but during that time, you notice something. Those children of Israel were fed. They had manna from heaven that showed up on the ground. They were fed physically. They were fed spiritually because Aaron and Moses gave them the 10 Commandments and all these wonderful teachings. I'm sharing this with you because it's a beautiful metaphor for what can happen even when we choose something more limited on a short term. Carolyn Mace says there are two paths in life, the path of woe and the path of wisdom. And we can pick either one, but both of them will get you there. The path of woe takes longer. And Myrtle Fillmore talked about that as well. She said there's the high road and the low road. And sometimes we pick the low road and it'll get there sooner or later, but we may spend some time wandering in the wilderness, during which time we will be fed spiritually, physically, in every other way. So, where in your life do you have an intention? Where can you set an intention? And next week we're going to, as a congregation on Palm Sunday, set a collective intention. We're going to set an individual intention and allow the energy and life of the Holy Week story, the Easter story, to move us forward. What do you want? The intention. What's in the way? Good Friday, letting it go, all the negativity and all the limitations. And what are you going to do about it, which is Easter? Now, James Dillett Freeman, Unity's poet laureate, he was the director of Silent Unity for many years. He had a very primitive intention when he was young. He was raised in the most brutal circumstances. He was raised in the bottoms of Kansas City, which was a pretty tough place and probably the most wide open, tough city in the United States. They didn't go through the Great Depression in Kansas City. Did you know that? Because they had gambling, prostitution, and drugs. So and they were able to weather it just fine. And that was what he grew up with. He said if the Fillmores hadn't found him, he would have been dead by the time he was 30. But what happened was that his brutal alcoholic father, and Freeman's life was probably the most difficult childhood I've ever heard or read about in fact or fiction, worse than anything in Charles Dickens. But his father took him to Unity Inn because he'd heard that his asthma could be cured by a vegetarian diet, and they served vegetarian meals, and it wasn't. But he did meet Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who found out that this young boy wrote poetry, and they loved his poetry. And so as time went on, they invited him to work with them in the summers. And this was during a period of time where there weren't many jobs available, especially for someone like him. And he fell in love with a young woman there and stayed. And he said, I didn't want to get involved in religion. He said, I tried to get out of there all the times. But what happened was that she kept me there because I fell in love with her. And when she died, he wrote the poem, I Am There. That's what came through him to deal with that. But his desire, he told me this in the last year of his life when we go out to lunch about once a month. And he said, when I was young, my childhood was so difficult that I had one burning desire, and my desire was this: I just want to help somebody. And I was involved in all kinds of things, and if the Fillmores knew what I was up to, they wouldn't have had me around. But he said the question was, how can I help people? What can I do to help people? How can I reach out to people and make a difference in their lives? And so he said, and I didn't know how I was going to fulfill that, but I did. And that was a powerful, powerful impetus for his entire life unfolding in a beautiful way. And he started to work with, he didn't really believe in prayer or anything. He just had this as a job. But as he saw people getting healings and saw people's lives turning around, and I've always thought, Freeman, it's in the days before 12-step movement. It was in the days before there were a lot of therapeutic aids. This unity teaching saved his life, he said. And I always think that if with his background, it could have the results that it did, it could have those same results for you and for me. Because what he dealt with was very, very, very difficult. So what is in your heart? What is the desire of your heart? For him is, I just want to help people. And he was given the means, and it rolled out, and it happened in a very different way than he ever expected because he wasn't religious. He wasn't raised religious. In your life, how can you set an intention that is so powerful, so filled with purpose and meaning that it just goes forth and unfolds beautifully? How many of you have heard of Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning? Viktor Frankl was, of course, a Holocaust survivor. He was a prisoner in a concentration camp. And in the midst of the most meaningless circumstance, he asked himself the question, how can I help people to find meaning in that which seems meaningless? How can I help people to find meaning in that which seems meaningless? And just as he worked with this, he began to have an unfoldment in his soul in the midst of the most difficult circumstances. And I want to read to you what he wrote in his book. That was the turning point when he came awake to the possibilities that were there, not just for him or the people around him, but for all humanity. He said, a thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it's said into the song by so many poets. proclaimed as final wisdom by so many thinkers. This truth, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which we can aspire. And I grasp the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of humanity is through love and in love. I'm going to say that again. The salvation of humanity is through love and in love. And I want to speak to a moment about the word salvation, because salvation has been misappropriated. The word salvation has nothing, and it had nothing in the days of Jesus, to do with being saved in an altar call so you can get into a heaven so everybody else gets to go to hell, and all the rest of the stuff that people have associated with salvation. The word salvos in Greek meant healthy. It literally meant get healthy. Get healthy, become whole. That's what salvation. So if somebody says to you, have you been saved? Just say, well, I'm working on it. Or, yes, but it's that wholeness of your being, that healthiness that you're working towards. Anyway, going back to Viktor Frankl, he said, I understood how a person who has nothing left in this world may still know bliss, may it be just for a brief moment in the contemplation of love, in the position of utter desolation when you can't express yourself in positive action, when your only achievement may consist in enduring your sufferings in the right way, in an honorable way. In such a position, you can, through the contemplation of love, achieve fulfillment. So, for the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meaning of the Psalms' words. The angels are lost in a perpetual contemplation of infinite glory. Now, here he is in a concentration camp with the people around him dying, with all the suffering. But what he came up with was a desire in his heart: how can I find meaning and how can I share meaning with other people? Not just myself or the other prisoners, but even those who put us here, who are probably the most meaningless in their lives of all. How can I put forth something that could help to transform this world and give it meaning? And it's interesting, the original book, the original title of the book, Man's Search for Meaning, was, he gave it this original title, Nevertheless, Say Yes to Life, a Psychologist Experiences a Concentration Camp. Nevertheless, say yes to life. How do you say yes? By inserting a cause in space and time and letting it move forward. By having a desire in your heart, knowing that that which is unlike it will come up, and then you will move into the fulfillment, which we're going to be celebrating in 2 weeks at Easter. There was a woman in one of my churches who had a desire to make a difference in her community when she was a court reporter. Now, how many of you have seen either of these two programs, Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul? Raise your hand. Well, they take place in Albuquerque, and after I left this church, I went to Albuquerque for 4 years, and I loved living there, but they accurately depict a lot that goes on in Albuquerque. I remember looking at this and, yeah, there's a little of that. Walter White's house was 6 blocks from my church, the house that they actually filmed this at. And she was a court reporter, and she got into this spiritual life, and she began to feel a sense of divine discontent, dissatisfaction. She came to me, she said, Greg, it's bringing me down. The stories I hear are so horrific and so negative, and I just hurt in my heart, and I carry it home with me. I don't know what to do. And I said, well, what is your heart telling you to do? What is it that you really desire in your heart? And she said, I just want to be a light in the world. I want to shine light. And she's thinking that meant she'd have to quit her job and go do something else that would help her to shine light. And I said, well, let's do some work on this. And she began to realize that her job was to sit there while she was doing her court reporting and shine light on every single individual, visualize them in light, pray for light while she was doing her court reporting. And she worked with this, and it became a spiritual practice that was so profound that she ended up being a Unity minister, and she has a church there in Albuquerque. Now, where in your life do you want to shine light? Where in your life do you have a desire in your heart that is coming forth that you want to experience and express meaning in a seemingly meaningless world? Where do you want to set an intention for freedom in your life? Where Moses said, let my people go. And yet the journey and the fulfillment looks so much different than what it is that seemed to show up. and yet it was so much more because it was a journey of growth and unlimited potential for good. There's a man who lives nearby, and I want to get in touch with him because he used to teach classes in this church back 25, 30 years ago. His name is Dr. George Elder, and he was at one time the head of the religion department at Hunter College, where my daughter went last year. But while he moved, after he moved down here, he's a Jungian psychotherapist and a psychologist, and one of the world's authorities in Jungian psychology. And he shared with me something about his intention as a child and how it it really moved his life and how it really changed him. When he was a little boy, he was raised in Appalachia, and in his Appalachian town, there was one church, and it was a snake handler's church. And his parents were snake handlers, and the people in the church were, where they pray and they're speaking in tongues, and they pray that in such a way that they would try to exercise their faith so that the poisonous snakes would not kill them. And that was their faith. And one of the things they taught him at the age of 7 or 8 was, if you tell the mountain to move, it'll move. And they were literalists, they were fundamentalists. So they believed that if you told a mountain to move, it would move. At least they told him that. So he sat or stood in his window looking at yonder mountain across the hollow and tried to prayerfully will it to move, and it didn't move, and he lost his faith. This is a story about him losing his faith and regaining it. You see, he wanted to move a mountain. That was his desire. That was the desire of his heart. That was the cause that he was inserting, and it didn't happen. Now, nobody in his family had ever gotten an education, but he went on, of course, to get his PhD, and as part of that journey, he joined the Peace Corps. They sent him to Thailand. He was sent to a small village in the mountains where there were Buddhist priests who taught him something that completely transformed him. He had lost his faith. He was an atheist, but he said, I found out from them, through them, that I could move mountains. But the mountains that I moved weren't the ones I thought I was supposed to move. They were mountains in consciousness. And where I moved the mountains was not where I thought I was going to move the mountains. It was in my heart. And I got my faith back in a new form. But it was the intention of that small child to move a mountain that was fulfilled as an adult, teaching people around the world about these spiritual principles through psychology. And in your life, right now, you're going to set an intention, yes, today, and maybe next week when we really go deep with this on Palm Sunday, and I hope you can come back then. We're going to go through all 3 steps. So Good Friday's part of that too, if you can make it. But you're going to set an intention that is, by definition, somewhat narrowly defined. No offense, but we're all evolving souls, and so my intentions, your intentions, are primitive at this point, and they're growing as we are growing and changing in our understanding. And so whatever you have in mind is good enough, because just like James Dillett Freeman's desire to help somebody, just like Jane Hart's desire to hear the voice of God, like Dr. George Elder's desire to move a mountain. In each of these cases, their desire looked primitive from our point of view, but they still had the seed and the essence of something powerful. Your desire right now is something that God will move with, will work with. And like the children of Israel, or Moses' desire was freedom, to lead his people to freedom. So God will work with whatever is there, and you will go through the processes, the changes, the circumstances. They're not always convenient. They're not always comfortable. They're not always fun, but they are fruitful, and they will lead you in the direction you need to go in order to grow into the soul who is then ready to move into your promised land. And so this is a challenge for this week. Look into your heart. Ask yourself, what is the desire of my heart? And move past the obvious desires, the one for a new car or boat or house or relationship or something. Those are all good desires. Move past even the desires for things to tangibly change in yourself or in the world. Those are good desires, and those are wonderful. But as Jesus said, seek first the kingdom, and all of those desires will be fulfilled, will be added unto you. Find a desire that fulfills the yearning of your heart. And maybe it would be to give and receive love. Maybe it would be to be the love that I seek, maybe it would be to awaken in God. Maybe it would be to grow spiritually, to know God. I don't know how because we're all different, and ultimately, in essence, we all want the same thing because our souls are yearning for the same thing, but we articulate it differently. We give different language to it. We give different words to it. And so let's move into that time of prayer where we can just get in touch with that desire as best we understand it, knowing that however we express it, God will work with it, even if it's a desire to move a physical mountain, it's good enough. God will work with it. And so get back in touch with your desire of your heart. And if you don't know what it is, just desire a spiritual something, something, something that is a more, something that is an expansion, a greater, an understanding. And know that this desire seed contains within itself everything that it needs for its fulfillment. This seed contains within it the image, as an acorn contains the image of an oak tree, of the fulfillment which looks nothing at all like the seed. And so take a moment and plant that seed, set that intention, and articulate that desire in your heart in the way that you need to do right now. And this prayer goes forth. This prayer is a powerful prayer. This prayer is gathered with all the energy and the yearning and the life and the love and support of all the good hearts that are here and moving forth for all of humanity. For we are stand ins for humanity. We are the microcosm of all of humankind's yearning. And so we know that it's moving forth. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. Thank you, God. And so it is.